What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another Fish the Moment live stream. Today, we're going to be talking about how to find the best section of your lake so you can consistently put bass in the boat, regardless of what lake you're on, time of year, conditions, anything like that. And I have a lot of great information to share with you guys, from how to break down a lake by water clarity. Sorry about that. Something in my throat. Water clarity, water temperature, by the type of bait fish you have, looking at natural factors like birds and current. A lot of great things to talk about in this live stream. And if you're watching this on the Apple, or listening to this in the Apple Podcast or Spotify, welcome. I will be uploading this live stream to YouTube as well as onto the podcast apps. And so if you want to listen to this while you're driving to the lake, then definitely check out the Fish the Moment podcast on the Apple iTunes app and on Spotify. And so today we're going to be breaking down a lot of awesome stuff, and this video topic, or the live stream topic, was recommended by my Patreon members. And so huge shout out to everyone who supports me on Patreon. I have 119 guys who support me every single month with a monthly donation, and I couldn't do this without you guys. So really appreciate all the support. And if you do want to join me on Patreon, you just go to Fish the Moment, or go to patreon.com/fishthemoment. Links will be in the description of this video on YouTube and the live stream. So other than that, I want to jump straight into it, guys. And I see that everyone is in the stream. Got 70 people, 80 people on already, which is crazy. We got B, got Joseph, Ernest, Justin, Gary, Quincy, Randy, Ron, Roger, so many guys, familiar faces, PK, Timo. How's everyone doing? So don't want to waste too much time going through the intro here. I want to jump straight into the topic and start talking about finding the right section of the lake. So let me get that pulled up really quick, guys, and we'll jump straight into it. There we go. Cool. So finding the right section of the lake. And what I mean by section of the lake is basically whether you're fishing on, let's say, the upper end of the lake, the mid section of the lake, or the lower end of the lake. And there's a lot of different ways that you can divide up a lake. And so sometimes it's not so clear to determine what the upper end of the lake is, what the mid part of the lake is, or the lower end. And there are a lot of factors that allow me to chop up a lake into sections. And sometimes it's not just by the geographical layout of the lake. Sometimes it's by water clarity, by available cover, by water temperatures. A lot of factors that dictate sections of a lake. And on smaller lakes like the one I'm showing here, it's pretty easy to divide up into 3 small sections. There's a lot of lakes that wind in multiple directions that might be 100 miles long, and it's hard to break these lakes up into sections. And so rather than just thinking about it maybe in like a 3-section layout, also maybe think about it in terms of every 5 miles of your lake is a new section. That's kind of a good rule of thumb if your lake is really big. Every 5 miles is a new section. If it's a smaller lake, maybe it's every mile is a new section. So don't get too caught up on specific boundaries when you're thinking about section of a lake. And I'll get into how I define sections. And so it's kind of a loose term. So don't get too caught up on it if that doesn't maybe apply perfectly to your lake like I'm showing here in the image. So anyways, next thing that I want to talk about are why different sections of the lake are different, and why it's important to try to even locate the correct section of a lake. A lot of times you might be going to the lake and think that you can catch them just as well on the lower end of the lake as you can on the upper end of the lake, and that anywhere you launch your boat is going to be productive. You just need to figure out the pattern for that given day. But that's not always the case. Sometimes there are certain sections of the lake that are better than others, and if you're not in that section, you're not going to be catching fish. And I'm sure you guys have seen this before. You go out to the lake one day maybe, and don't catch any fish on the lower end, and then your buddy launched in the mid section of the lake and he caught 40 fish. And you might be thinking, well, man, I just suck, or I was throwing the wrong bait, or whatever. But it might not be that. It might literally just be that you should have been fishing in the midsection of the lake, and if you were up there, you would have caught 40 fish as well. And that can play into your fishing style, the water temperature, a lot of factors, which we're going to get into here. And really my 5 key factors in selecting an area of the lake or a section of the lake is water clarity, water temperature, available cover, current flow or water flow, and the species of bass. And so we're going to get into all of these factors, break them down one by one, and then we'll also get into some of the key things I look for in a productive or active section of a lake. So lots to cover, so let's go right into it. So between all these factors, I believe that water clarity is really the number one factor I use to differentiate the section of a lake. And I'm actually going to pull up Google Earth here to show you guys what I'm talking about. And really, section of a lake can be broken up in so many different ways, like I mentioned earlier, but one easy way is by that water clarity. And so if we go over here to Lake DeGray in Arkansas, we have a pretty good example of a lake that has a very drastic change in water clarity from one end to the other. This lake is not very long. It's maybe 10 miles from kind of east over here to west. And in general, if I was going to break up this lake, I would break it up into 3 sections. You have the upper end of the lake, up here in the top left corner, which is where the river runs in and the water is dirtiest. Then you have the midsection of the lake in here, where that water has medium visibility, like stained to slightly clear. Then you have very clear water down by the dam. And there's sometimes where the clear water on the lake is at the very north section of the lake, for example, on Beaver Lake. And there was actually a lot of confusion when I made a video on Beaver Lake a while back where I talked about the upper end of the lake being the clear end. A lot of guys think that the upper end of the lake is always the dirty end of the lake, but it's all just kind of terminology. It's not really that big of a deal what you name it. On Beaver Lake, the clear water is on the north side of the lake, and the dirty water is on the south side of the lake. That's where the river comes in, and the lake actually runs south to north, which is not super common, as opposed to a lake, for example, like 10 Killer Lake here, where the dirty water is in the north section of the lake, which is the most common. That's where most of your lakes set up. They set up with the dirty water up north, the clearest water down south, and then you'll have that change in water clarity throughout the lake. And there's a lot of different variations of this, and this is why it can be confusing sometimes for guys when they're trying to think about areas or sections of a lake, because it's so different. But really the way I think about it to simplify it is just breaking the lake up by different water clarities. And if you're looking at Google Earth here, one way that's easy to tell water clarities is look at the water, and if it has a very dark green or dark blue tint to it, that's going to be your clear water. And on Lake DeGray, this has 5 to 7 feet of visibility down by the dam. Then as you get up to the midsection, you can see the water gets a little bit more green, a little bit lighter colored, but it's not super bright. It's kind of a neutral green kind of color. This is going to be your stained to slightly clear water, let's say 2 to 4 feet of visibility. Then if you get this water that's super bright green and it kind of pops off the screen here on Google Earth, that's going to be your dirty water. And this is water that has, let's say, a foot or less of visibility, maybe up to 2 feet of visibility in certain sections, but it's your dirtier water. And so I'll break up this lake into sections based on where that water clarity changes. So everywhere where there's 2 feet of visibility and less is the upper end of the lake. Everything where there's 2 feet of visibility to 4 feet of visibility, that's mid-lake. Everything 4 feet of visibility or more is the lower end of the lake. That's just the way I break up lakes personally, and that's maybe a rule that you can follow, but you can follow it anyway. You could break it up into 8 sections where you have 1 foot of visibility, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot, 6, 7, 8 feet. You have 8 sections. I wouldn't recommend that because that's a lot more to dig through and you're just making it harder for yourself. So usually I like to break it up. If you're looking at a lake that's maybe 10 miles long, break it up into 3-mile sections, 3.5-mile sections. If your lake is 100 miles long, you may have to break it up into 25-mile sections. It all just depends. So let's see here. Some people are saying that is anyone else's vision blurry? Let me make sure that just let me know if the stream is a little bit blurry, guys. Don't want to have a blurry stream here. It looks good on my end. It says excellent connection, so I don't know if it's just connection there. There is a thunderstorm going through. My power went out yesterday and killed the internet, so if the stream stops for whatever reason, don't worry, I will get right back on the stream. Just for sometimes the internet goes out here. Some people are saying no sound. Some people are saying blurry vision. Some people are fine, I guess. So I'll just keep rolling with it. We'll see what's going on. But anyway, so that's the section of the lake. So what I do with this information with the water clarity is pretty important because water clarity has a big influence on not only how deep I'm fishing, but also the techniques I'm using and the style of fishing I'm going to be doing. And so let's start with the style of fishing. In general, when you get in this clear water section, you're going to be doing a lot more finesse fishing, especially if you have no wind, no cloud cover, and it's bright bluebird skies. You're going to be throwing a lot of finesse finesse rods, spinning rods. You're going to throw lighter line, fluorocarbon, maybe Ned rigs, drop shots, finesse swim baits. That's what's going to get you the most bites in these clear sections of the lake. As opposed to maybe the upper end of the lake that's dirty, where you have a foot of visibility, you might be able to get away with braided line, 20-pound fluorocarbon, flipping, throwing a crankbait, a spinnerbait up in shallow water. And there's a lot of guys that just don't like fishing in clear water. They don't like the spinning rods, the finesse setup. They don't like to try to fish offshore, and that's just not their way of fishing. And so if you stuck a guy who's not confident in fishing in that clear water down in the lower end of Lake DeGray, they're probably not going to do that well. But if you put them up here in the river section, they might catch some fish. They may not do as well as the guys down here on the lower end of the lake, but they might do okay. And that's just because the style of fishing they're going to be doing fits the section of the lake they're in. And so one of the main determinants of which section of the lake I'm trying to look for is based on my style of fishing that I want to do on a given fishing day. Now, personally, I'm very versatile, so I am just as comfortable fishing in 2 inches of visibility or 20 feet of visibility, and I have 10 spinning rods and like 15 bait casters in my boat at all times. So I can adapt to anything, and that's something I have worked on my whole life, is being very versatile. So I could run from one end of DeGray to the other and catch them on any given day. But for guys who just get to go out once a week, or maybe they don't get to go out even once a month, and they're not that well versed, let's say, on finesse fishing, or maybe they're not that confident fishing in super dirty water because they grew up mainly in California with clear water lakes. Well, don't force yourself to fish in a section of the lake that doesn't fit your style. That is one of the worst ways to go about fishing, is forcing yourself to adapt to the conditions when you're not confident and you don't have a strong background on that type of fishing. So, for example, you're not going to be very successful the first time you go out and throw a frog for the first time. A lot of times throwing a frog takes a lot of hours and hours of building confidence, figuring out the right situation to throw it in, and you have to build up your skills with that bait. But, if you're really versed with a shaky head, a drop shot, and a Ned rig, and you can catch fish doing that, you're probably going to be better off just going to that clear end of the lake, fishing those baits you have confidence in. You're going to put more fish in the boat. So fishermen can be pretty stubborn. They might watch a video from, let's say, Tactical Bassin or whatever, see a bunch of baits that are like, oh, these are the best baits on the market. I'm going to go buy this and try to throw it on my lake. And they can go fishing one time in a month, and they don't catch anything, and they get discouraged. Well, if you're going once a month and you just want to put fish in the boat, go to the section of the lake that fits your style. Upper end and dirty water, if you're a power fisherman, flipping spinnerbait and jigs. If you like that finesse fishing, go to the clear end of the lake and start there. Now, if you don't really have a preference between the clear water and the dirty water, maybe you're a little more versatile, or you just don't have confidence in anything, then the big thing that I would focus on is trying to find that middle water clarity, that 2 to 4 foot of visibility. A lot of times it is a little bit easier for newer fishermen and for versatile fishermen to catch fish when you have that 2 to 4 foot of visibility, because it offers you the potential to fish shallow and fish deep, finesse style, and power fishing. And so I spend most of my time on Lake DeGray in this midsection of the lake, in that 2 to 4 foot of visibility. That's where I am always most confident when I go to the lake. And so I, as a generalist, as someone who's comfortable with a lot of things, I like the flexibility to launch in the middle of the lake. And if I get taken down to the lower end, I go there. If I go up to the upper end, I go there, and I'll let the conditions dictate that, which we'll get into in a little bit here. So, anyways, the next thing that we want to talk about is, one more thing on water clarity. 1 second here. Let me pull up the PowerPoint really quick. One more thing on water clarity. I talked about this in one of my videos in the past, and it was how deep to fish based on water clarity. And this is a video on my channel that's literally titled How Deep to Fish Offshore. So it's an explanation of how deep you need to fish. It explains what the thermocline is, which is something that you guys might be interested in learning about if you're gonna be fishing offshore. Definitely check out this video. It's one of the best videos on my channel, and it will really help you dial in how deep you need to be fishing. And I basically have these guidelines of how deep to fish based on water clarity. And really, I determined these guidelines off of personal experience from like 15 years of fishing. And I've actually experimented with this, really spent a lot of time dialing this in, so this isn't just random numbers I put on the page. I actually tested this over years and years of offshore fishing and things like that to really get this dialed in. And what I find is that there's a certain after a certain water visibility, those fish can't see very deep into the water once the visibility gets worse and worse. So that was a really bad way of phrasing that. Let me rephrase that. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that when you have, let's say, 0 to 1 foot of visibility, that sunlight only penetrates, let's say, 8 to 10 feet into the water. And bass can only feed a lot of times by sight and very limited by their lateral line. So they can feel vibrations from their lateral line, but it's not like a wide radius. And so a lot of the bites you're going to be getting when you're fishing, especially in deeper water offshore, are visual bites. And so a lot of times when you have 0 to 1 foot of water visibility, those fish can't see very well deeper than 8 feet because that light isn't penetrating into the water past 8 feet. And so it's basically like throwing yourself into a middle of a dark room and it's like, hey, eat this pizza. You can't see anything right now. It's completely pitch black, but eat this pizza. Well, if you do that, you're probably going to make a mess of yourself. You're going to knock the pizza on the floor. You're going to get it all over yourself. It's going to be a mess. And the same thing with these bass. When they get down into 12, 13 feet of water, when there's 0 to 1 foot of visibility, it's very hard for them to track down those bait fish or whatever forage they're feeding on. And they really have a hard time locating their prey. And so they're not going to be as effective eating. So instead, they want to get up in shallower water where the light penetrates in the water. They can see what's going on and they can ambush those bait fish. And so that's something that I'm always paying attention to, is that water visibility, and using these guidelines is how deep to fish. And basically what I'm saying here is this is how deep the bass will feed. Bass will live deeper than 8 feet of water when there's 0 to 1 foot of visibility. Sometimes bass will be suspended over 40 foot of water and they're sitting in 15 feet. But they're not feeding in that situation. It's kind of like when we go to bed at night, we'll go sit in our bedroom and sleep with the lights off. But when we want to eat, we're going to get out of our bed, walk in the kitchen, turn the lights on, and eat. We're not going to eat in the middle of a pitch black bedroom. Same thing with these fish. They're not going to eat in 15 foot of water where they can't see anything. They're going to go get out of 15 foot of water, move up into 4, 5, 6 feet of water, even when the water temperatures are freezing or super hot. I find that when you have 0 to 1 foot of visibility, you can catch fish in 40-degree water in 4 foot of water. And you can catch fish in 90-degree water temperatures in 4 foot of water, even though there is deeper water available, just because of that visibility. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Anyways, so let's go. Now people are saying, now I'm hungry. That's PK. I wish I had pizza, guys. That should be a button I should put on the live stream here. You can click to order Domino's Pizza. I need to get like a Domino's Pizza sponsorship. Or pizza. What type of pizza would you guys want me to get sponsored by? That's a great question for the live stream. Very relevant to fishing. So next thing other than water clarity is water temperature. And actually water clarity and water temperature kind of go hand in hand. And basically what I find is that water temperature is going to fluctuate a lot from lake to lake, again, based on your water clarity. I've talked about this in several videos, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. But basically what you'll find is that on the clear end of your lakes, where you have, let's say, 4 to 8 feet of visibility, the water is going to cool down and warm up slower than it will in very dirty water where you have 1 foot of visibility. So for example, let's say that there's a really big warming trend in the spring, and it's March, and you have 4 or 5 days of 60-degree weather. And let's say that the water temperature on the upper end of the lake and the lower end of the lake were equal, both 45 degrees. Well, over that 4-day warming trend of bright sunny skies and 60-degree weather, you might find that the water temperatures on the upper end of the lake go from 45 degrees to 55 degrees in 4 days. Whereas opposed to the lower end of the lake where it's clear, water temperatures might go from 45 degrees maybe to 48 degrees, maybe a 3-degree swing. And that's just because the water is deeper, it's clearer, it doesn't warm up as well, there's less particles in the water to kind of capture heat and warm up the water. And so the temperature swings from warming trends are not going to be as strong. So there's certain times when in the spring you may actually want to be fishing up in the dirty section of the lake after a warming trend or during a warming trend, because that water is going to warm up quicker. Those fish are going to pull up shallow and are going to start feeding really well. And maybe the lower end of the lake, the bite might stay consistent, maybe is decent, but maybe not as good as it is where you can go up to the river, to the dirty water, catch them on a spinnerbait, a crankbait, and it's easy fishing. Now, the same thing happens with cold fronts. Let's say you get 3 days or 4 days of really cold weather. You get a big cold front that comes through. Maybe the water temperatures were 55 degrees on both the upper end and the lower end of the lake. But you have 4 days in a row of like 30-degree nights, 20-degree nights, and like the highs are in the 40s. So super cold weather. Well, what will happen is that the water temperature on the upper end of these lakes, where the water is very dirty, 0 to 1 foot of visibility, might cool down from 55 degrees to 45 or 48 degrees over a 3 or 4 day period like that. It'll just get very, very cold quickly. It may not drop that much. It might drop like 5 degrees, so like 55, maybe down to 50 in that 4 day period. And then in the clear end of the lake, that water temperature will start at 55, and it may only drop to maybe 52, 51, 52 degrees. And so the swing will be a lot less, maybe half as much. So it'll fall 2 degrees as opposed to 5 degrees. And that is a big deal when you're fishing in the pre-spawn and these fish are getting ready to spawn. That 5 versus 2 degree drop in water temperature can completely mess up the fish on the upper end of the lake where it's dirty and that water temperature dropped a lot, versus the clear end where maybe that 2 degree temperature drop didn't really bother the fish. They're still going to be feeding and active. And so that's one thing that's really important to pay attention to about different sections of the lake, is that your water temperature will be different. And not only will it be different from cold fronts, things like that, it'll just be different in general. So you'll find that the lower end of the lake water temperature in certain times of the year, let's say in March, might be 50 degrees the second week of March, and the upper end of the lake might be 60 degrees. And so where you have that dirty water, you have 60 degree water. Where you have the clear water, you have 50 degree water. That's a 10 degree swing in water temperature from one end of the lake to the other. I've seen that happen all the time. And that 10 degree swing might mean that the fish on the lower end of the lake, where it's 50 degrees, is going to be, those fish will be in that pre-spawn mode, versus the fish on the upper end of the lake, where it's 60 degrees, those fish might be in their late pre-spawn or spawning mode, and the techniques and tactics you're going to fish are completely different. So that's something that's really important. And to kind of show you an illustration with a graphic, let me pull it up really quick. Man, it's lightning like crazy. I hope my internet does not go down. There's a lot of thunder. But anyways, so this is the water temperature difference here. So what you might find is that on a regular year, when water temperatures are 60 degrees, that's when those bass spawn. Well, they normally will spawn, let's say in April, when that water temperature is 60 degrees. But on certain sections of the lake, let's say on the lower end, you might not hit 60 degree water till the first week of April. But on the upper end of the lake, you might hit 60 degree water the second week of March. So 2 weeks earlier, those fish will start spawning versus one end of the lake or the other. And so if we go back over to Google Earth, what you'll find is that these fish might, again, be spawning on one end of the lake and be pre-spawn or late winter even on the lower end of the lake, just because that water temperature is changing. And one good question I saw over here from Pat Collins is, how far will bass travel from one end of the lake to the other in a day? It's a great question. It's something that I always get questions about all the time. One thing that people really misunderstand is they think that a fish that's living on the upper end of the lake up here in the river will travel 3 or 4 miles in a day or a week or a year and move from the upper end of the lake all the way to the lower end of the lake in like a day or two. That does not happen. What happens with these fish is they are going to, if they were born in the river up here, they're going to live in the river. If they were born on the lower end of the lake, they're going to stay on the lower end of the lake. They're not going to move from one section to the other most of the time unless there's a drastic change in habitat. Like let's say that the grass dies out on the lower end of DeGray, which it did, and those fish make a mass migration to the midsection of the lake. But that's something that will happen over like a 5-year period, not week to week, month to month, or even year to year. And so in a given fishing day, fish might move 50 yards, maybe 100 yards in a fishing day, like at the most. And then over the course of maybe a month, they might move a couple hundred yards, maybe, but maybe they just move 100 yards. And then over the course of maybe half a year, they might move, maybe a quarter mile, but that's like at the most. So these fish are not moving huge amounts. They're not like swimming from this pocket here 1.5 miles up the river to this next creek. That's not happening. It's something that might happen over, again, 5-year period because the conditions change. Let's say it's a tidal river and more salt water is moving into the fishery, and so they move to the cleaner water, or the habitat change like grass and stuff like that. But again, that's a long-term transition, not a short-term one. And the other says, good question, how far will they travel, especially now that it's post-spawn, shad spawn? So, like, for example, the fish might spawn here in the middle of this pocket, and they might move 100 yards from spawn to post-spawn. Over 2-3 weeks, they might move 100 yards to move to a shad spawn, but they're not going to move like 4 miles to go to a shad spawn. They're picking these spawning areas because they know that there's bait fish around, and I can get into another video. That's actually a whole other topic. I don't want to go into that tangent. That's a lot of information to cover. So that's a whole other theory and conversation topic. So we can maybe talk about that in another video. I don't want to get too strayed from this. And Kevin says tournaments probably relocate fish. That is true. So yeah, if people are catching fish way up here in Schaus Ford and bring them all the way back down to the state park, yeah, those fish will get relocated by tournaments. But again, that is a long-term thing. That's something that maybe happens over 2 or 3 years. It's not going to damage the fish population if we take, 3 or 4 tournaments of fish down to the lower end of the lake. Over a year it might have a big impact if there's a huge big tournament venue that gets put in, but there's so many fish in the lake, guys, we're not catching that many and bringing them back. It's not that big of a deal. So real quick, guys, we are about 30 minutes in the stream, and I actually want to take a quick break to talk about some business stuff for my channel, because obviously I'm doing these live streams for you guys and I love doing them, but I really don't make very much money, if any money, off the live streams, and so I don't make any money off the podcast as well if you're listening there. And so really the way that I'm able to monetize these podcasts and keep doing them is 2 ways. One is through Patreon, which is a monthly donation service, which I have information about right here to the right of the screen, and you can go into fishthemoment.com as well, and I'll pull that up here, and you can find my Patreon page. Go to fishthemoment.com, go to support Fish the Moment page, and you can go here, and this is a great way to do a monthly donation. You can vote on this live stream topics. You can also get exclusive videos that I post to Patreon members, and I also publish all of my fishing spots that I fish every single month. I give you a literal map with every spot I've caught a fish over the last month, and I break that down for some of my Patreon members. So that's something that I'll do. Another good way, if you maybe aren't able to support me monetarily through Patreon, a couple other good ways to do this is to actually use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. And all you have to do is go again, fishthemoment.com, support Fish the Moment, and you have my Tackle Warehouse link. And if you use this link, I get a certain percentage of every single purchase you make on Tackle Warehouse. And so if you check out, I will get a little bit of the profit, and that helps me support my channel, things like that. And you're already buying fishing tackle already, so it's a great way to support the channel if you can't do like a monthly donation. And you can just bookmark this URL, this link, so that every time you pull up Tackle Warehouse, you can use my link. So for example, when I come here and click on Tackle Warehouse, my link right here, $from equals Fish the Moment. You can't see it on the live stream, but basically I've saved my URL. It's bookmarked. So just go to fishthemoment.com, use that URL. And then another great way to support me, again, if you're not wanting to do Tackle Warehouse, maybe you don't use it, maybe you can't do a monthly donation, is to purchase one of my lake breakdowns or fishing playbooks. For example, one easy way to do it is buy a copy of my Fish the Moment Offshore Fishing Playbook, or my Ultimate Guide to Bass Fishing Rods. It's $20 for the rod guide, $50 for the Offshore Fishing Playbook. It's well worth the money. Guaranteed the content will be useful for you. I spent about 45 hours making the Offshore Fishing Playbook, and I spent about 20 hours making the rod guide. And so obviously that was just making it, and I spent 10 years of knowledge putting it all together, testing equipment, stuff like that. So that's something that's on my website, and it's a great way to support me. Rather than just giving me like a donation, you can just purchase a rod guide, you get something in return for the donation, and that's something you can do. So that's just some things you guys can do. And lake breakdowns are also available, as you guys know. I actually posted 4 more today for the lake breakdowns. We just added Lake Cherokee in Tennessee, Old Hickory Lake in Tennessee, Lake Hartwell, and Lake Murray. And so these breakdowns have 60 areas that you guys can fish on your lake. Gives you 60 spots with descriptions, bait recommendations, key takeaways for the lake, key details that Randy Blockett, who makes the maps, has learned after 20 years of tour experience fishing all these lakes. He understands what's going on, he knows what he's doing, and they're awesome. So anyways, that is what I have here. And then also, obviously, if you want a personal breakdown, you can do a one-on-one virtual fishing lesson. I talk about these all the time, so I'm sure you guys know about them already. And I am already booked up for the next 2 weeks straight, and I have another one in 3 weeks, but all my times are booking up like crazy. So if you want a one-on-one virtual fishing lesson, I book now. I'm booking like 2 a day every single day, and I'm probably going to be booked out for a month pretty soon. So definitely check these out if you want some one-on-one instruction from me. So enough of all that. Let's jump back over to the PowerPoint and keep talking. Need to do the business stuff. You guys understand. Anyways, so next up, let's talk about another factor. And there is a species of bass. That's another factor that I really pay attention to. I just saw, too, that we have a tornado watch in our area. So hopefully we are not going to have a problem. Let me just take half a second to look at the radar because I don't want to get blown away by a tornado. And while we're doing that, maybe you guys are just going to ask the question. Just give me half a second. I just want to make sure that we're safe. We're in Oklahoma. I'm right close to Oklahoma, and it's kind of by the tornado alley. And north of me, there's been huge tornadoes. Over the border in Oklahoma, there's crazy tornadoes, and so it gets really rough here. I've never had to worry about here exactly where I'm at. Oh, that is. I don't know if y'all can see that. That is not bueno. That's a lot, but it looks like we're fine. I think if the stream cuts off, then you probably should worry. But it looks like we just have thunderstorm warnings in my area, so we should be good. Okay, cool. Back to the stream. You're going to say, Quincy's saying stay safe. Thank you. Anyway, so species of bass. So when I'm talking about species of bass, I'm talking about largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass. And a lot of times I choose the section of the lake I'm fishing depending on which species of bass I want to target. And this can be very important depending on which fishery you're on. So for example, I just put up a little graphic here of Table Rock Lake. This is a lake that has all three species of bass. So you have largemouth, spotted bass, and smallmouth. And targeting specific species of bass can be very helpful if, for example, you just really want to go catch a smallmouth. So if you want to go catch a smallmouth on Table Rock, I would recommend going here towards the dam. This is where a lot of the good smallmouth are in this lake, and I would say that the majority of the population of bass in this area are smallmouth. And let's say then you want to go catch spotted bass, and that's the fish you want to target, then you might want to head over here towards the White River area on Table Rock. There's a majority of the bass are spotted bass in this section, and a lot of times if you are going out with your family, stuff like that, spotted bass are easier to catch. They group up in bigger schools, and you can normally catch a lot of fish, especially on Table Rock. You can catch 50, 60 spotted bass a day pretty easily in the White River area. And so it's great if you're just going out for fun, just to set the hook, build confidence, stuff like that. And then if you're, let's say, targeting largemouth, and maybe you're in a tournament and want those tournament caliber bass, usually on most lakes, the largemouth are going to weigh more than your spotted bass and your smallmouth. And so a lot of times targeting largemouth is a good strategy for tournaments. And so in that case, I would go up the James River or maybe go down the Long Creek here on Table Rock Lake. And so obviously there's going to be a mixture of all species. So there's spotted bass in all these areas, there's smallmouth in all these areas, but the majority of the bass population is going to be one species in these sections I've marked. And then in this midsection of the lake, you have spotted bass, smallmouth, and largemouth kind of equally mixed. And this is something you just kind of have to learn about your lake, but there are a couple tricks to kind of understanding what species is going to be in which section. And so let me pull up Google Earth and kind of talk about that really quick. And so again, not every lake is going to have this mixture either of fish. But basically, for example, if you're looking at Lake Lanier here in Georgia, on Lake Lanier, it's famous for spotted bass. You can catch a lot of nice spotted bass, even up to 4-pound spotted bass. And that's really good for some tournaments if you want to go out and try to catch numbers and quality. But sometimes, fishing for spotted bass can be difficult because you need to understand your electronics really well. You need to be able to drop shot, throw a swim bait, stuff like that in offshore cane piles, brush piles, and it might just not fit your style. And so if you're fishing a tournament, you might want to focus more on largemouth because they might weigh a little bit more and maybe that's more of your comfort zone. So on Lake Lanier, you can actually run up into some of these rivers and creek arms where you have dirty water and you'll find more largemouth. And that's something that you're going to find on pretty much any fishery in the country that has spotted bass and largemouth. The largemouth are going to position in that dirty water in the rivers and creeks, and the spotted bass are going to position in the clear end of the lake, and they'll be suspended over deeper water. And so if you want to primarily target largemouth and just focus on largemouth, let's say for a tournament or things like that, go to your dirty water, run into the rivers. That's where you're going to find more largemouth. If you want to go after spotted bass, stick to the clear water. And this will work as well for smallmouth fisheries. So if you're fishing like Lake Cumberland, Lake Cherokee, a lot of times the largemouth will be in the dirty water sections. The smallmouth will be in the clear water sections. And there are certain tournaments or certain lakes where you can win just off smallmouth. There's certain lakes where you can only win on largemouth for tournaments. So that's something you have to learn about your lake, but that does have a big influence on the section of the lake I'm going to fish. And it really just comes down to which species I want to target on a given day. And so it might not be that the section of the lake, for example, the James River is the best section of the lake for catching fish, or maybe is the easiest section of the lake to catch fish in, but maybe because it has largemouth in it and those fish weigh heavier on Table Rock, if I'm in a tournament and want to catch a 20-pound bag of bass, I'm going to the James River because it gives me the best chance of putting that big bag of fish in the boat, as opposed to fishing maybe in the White River, which has a lot more spotted bass. So that's that. Next thing that we have on the list is available cover. And this is a really interesting because this is a factor that will fluctuate lake to lake again. And so a lot of these things I'm talking about, guys, are general guidelines. They're not going to apply to every single lake, and it's not going to be consistent lake to lake, even one lake to another that are 20 miles apart, 5 miles apart, or right next to each other. And so just take these ideas in a broad sense, high level, and then try to apply what you can to your home lake. Again, these things I'm talking about are not always going to be applicable to what you're talking about. But when I mean available cover, what I'm really talking about is what type of boat docks, grass, wood, rock, things like that do you have on your lake. And so one really good example of this is actually Lake Conroe down in Texas. And Lake Conroe is interesting because it's half developed on the lower end of the lake, and then it is pretty much wild and untamed on the upper end of the lake. And this causes each section of the lake to have very different types of cover that are available, and it might choose what you want to do or how you want to fish going into the day. So for example, on the lower end of Lake Conroe, a lot of fish are caught on boat docks, seawalls, and kind of like riprap rocky banks. And so you're going to have a lot of boat docks, you have these seawall areas, and that's just because these lakes are developed. They're very, very developed, and they're going to have lots of boat docks and seawalls. I don't know what I'm trying to say there, but you guys get what I'm saying. But if we go up the lake, for example, past the bridge and up to the top section, you'll notice that there's no more development. There's no more seawalls. There's no more boat docks. It's all just flooded bushes and trees. And so you don't have any flooded bushes and trees on the lower end of the lake, but on the upper end of the lake you do. And so the style of fishing you're going to be doing is different. The way the fish set up around the bank and the shoreline is completely different. And maybe you're not a big fan of fishing boat docks and seawalls. Maybe that's just something you don't like doing. Maybe you're not good at skipping a fishing lure, so you don't want to fish boat docks. Well, maybe you're better off coming up to the upper end of the lake where you have a lot of bushes and trees, and maybe you're better at flipping and throwing a spinnerbait, so you can catch them doing that here. And then another thing about Conroe is if you go even further up the lake, there's actually some grass in some of these creeks and pockets. And so you can actually find some grass as well. And so if you're a big grass fisherman, you can run way up to the top of Conroe and fish grass, fish in the kind of mid-upper end with bushes and trees, or fish on the lower end with docks and seawalls. And depending on what your strength is, you might want to pick one of these sections of the lake over another just to maximize your abilities, your strengths, and what you're confident in. Now, another thing that's a big player about this this type of fishery is that a lot of times the size of the fish will be different depending on which section of the lake you're fishing. And so when I talk about size of the fish, what I really mean is that you're going to have bigger fish on the lower end or the clear end of a lot of these fisheries, and you'll have smaller fish on the upper end, the dirtier water sections. That's just kind of a rule of thumb with a lot of reservoirs around the south and the Midwest section. It's not always the rule, but a lot of times wherever you have the deeper, clear water, you're going to have a higher number of big fish, a higher percentage of big fish, maybe not number, but higher percentage of big fish to your area. So for example, on Conroe, if you want to go catch a 6 to 15 pound bass, you want to fish on the lower end of the lake in the clear water. If you want to catch a lot of 3 and 4 pound bass, by all means head up to the dirtier water on the upper end of the lake, and there's a lot more numbers, and you can catch a lot more 2 to 4 pounders up here where the kind of development ends. But if you want to catch those big fish, those true Texas giants, you need to fish on the lower end of the lake in the clear water. So that's just one other thing to pay attention to. Another thing that's kind of interesting, if we go over to our Navionics, just give me a second to switch over here, is that offshore structure is also going to be different depending on which lake you're on. So for example, one very stark example is a small little lake by my house, which is Lake Uchi. And Lake Uchi is very unique because the type of offshore structure is very different based on each section of the lake as well. And so you can kind of break up this lake into kind of the lower end of the lake, the mid lake, and the upper end of the lake. And what you'll notice is in the upper end of the lake, you have very shallow water. It's like 4 or 5 foot of water. There are lots of just small little ditches. There's some grass. There's not really that much offshore structure or cover. It's just a big flat with a bunch of stumps and wood. And then as you kind of go into the midsection of the lake, you notice the banks are very steep. The contour lines come straight up to the bank, and you have a lot of rocky shorelines. And so this section has very little rock and more just like grass and wood. The midsection has lots of rock, and the banks are super steep. There's not a lot of flat places that extend off the bank that would give you places to fish offshore. And then as you get to the lower end of the lake, you get a lot of very defined main river channel ledges where you have a big flat that extends out in the middle of the lake and a sharp drop, which creates a ledge. And so you'll have these ledges that run all through the bottom end of this lake. And it's very interesting because, for example, if you wanted to fish offshore on this lake, which is really good in the summertime and certain times of the year, I would only fish on the lower end of the lake because that's the only place where you have these offshore areas where the flats extend out very far off the bank. You have these sharp drops. You don't have any of that stuff in the midsection of the lake here. The banks are super steep. There's 20, 30 feet of water within a cast of the bank, where on the lower end of Lake Uchi, you may go 100 yards off the bank before you hit 20 feet of water. And then it'll drop off sharply into the creek channel in 60 feet. And so, depending on the section lake you're in, the available structure for offshore fishing is also different. So you have to pay attention to that. So, as you can see, there's so many factors that go into picking the right section of the lake. And a lot of it, again, depends on what you're confident in. If you're not a big offshore fisherman and you don't like fishing away from the bank, don't go to the areas of the lake where you see a lot of nice offshore ledges and points and drop-offs, things like that. That's not maybe the way you need to be going. Maybe the best thing for you to do if you're fishing on Lake Uchi is to go to the midsection of the lake and fish down these steeper rocky banks. And one thing I'll say is, like on Uchi, you can catch fish in the summer, the spring, the winter in this midsection of the lake and never fish offshore. And this is the place to do it. If you're going to fish shallow year-round, or maybe not shallow, but fish at the bank year-round, go to the area of the lake where there's very limited offshore structure, because that's going to force the fish to be up against the bank and be up shallow, or at least to cast off the bank. Or you go way up the river up here and also find fish in even shallower water. But if you like offshore fishing and it's a confidence thing, a strength of yours, then don't fish this midsection lake where there's very limited offshore structure. Don't try to force yourself to fish in the area of the lake where there's very little structure. Go to the section lake that has all of the good offshore structure, where you have the good drops, the humps, the ledges, and fish there. Don't try to force a technique onto a section of the lake. Let the section of the lake dictate the technique you're going to use. And pick the section of the lake based on the technique that you're confident in and that you want to fish. That is the number one thing you need to do when you're picking a section of the lake. Find the section that suits your strength, the way you like to fish. So, let's see, which one was that? Give me 1 second. You go back to the PowerPoint here. That was the available cover, kind of in structure. I probably should have said structure cover. I covered a lot of stuff in that point, but you guys get the idea. Next is the current and the water flow. And so this is something that's very important, is the amount of current and water flow that goes into your lake. Now I'm going to be very brief about this one, but basically what I'm talking about is that certain sections of certain lakes will have more current than others. So for example, if we go over to, let's see here, I need to find a Tennessee River lake. Which one are we going to pull up? So for example, Pickwick. Or maybe we'll pick over here. Yeah, let's go over here. So we have is this Wheeler? I'm confused on which lake I'm on. That's gonna feel okay. Let's go Pickwick. So we got Pickwick here. So Pickwick, I was thinking we could go below Wilson Dam, but that's fine. So this is Lake Wilson. This is Pickwick Lake. And a lot of times on these like Tennessee River Valley Authority lakes, or TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority lakes, you're going to have dams. And a lot of times the dams are going to release water throughout the day to fluctuate and change the water levels to help with incoming, outgoing rain and stuff like that. And so certain times you're going to have lots of current right by these dams. And the current flow is going to be the strongest, most pronounced right up by the dam. And so a lot of guys will take advantage of this and fish below the tail races on like the Pickwick Dam, Wheeler Dam, places like that, and catch a lot of good fish. And it is a proven technique for catching good bass year-round. And the current will continue through this whole lake. It'll go all the way through the entire lake, but the effect won't be felt as much in the midsection of the lake as it is right by the dam where the water's coming out. And it will still be going through the lake, it's just not going to be as obvious. And so a lot of times, guys will take advantage of these tail races, especially in the summertime when it's really hot, or maybe just throughout the entire year to put good fish in the boat. And so a lot of times by changing the section of the lake, you can find areas that have a more pronounced effect by the current. Now, another thing that's really important to pay attention to is not only the current in that perspective, but let's say we go back over to Lake DeGray over here in Arkansas. Sometimes what you'll find is that if you have really heavy rain like we have going on right now, where there's a tornado literally like probably above my apartment right now, it's very loud. Hopefully it's not on the audio. But anyways, if you're on Lake DeGray and let's say you get a really heavy rain, well, what might happen is that after the rain, you might want to be rolling up here into Arley Moor and running into the back of one of these creeks because you'll get runoff from that rain. And a lot of times in the springtime and the summer, these fish will get stacked up in the back of these creeks because the bait fish will move into the back of these creeks where that incoming water is coming in. That fresh water will carry plankton from the bank and like debris and bugs and things like that. The shad will feed on, and the bass will move back in there to feed on the shad. The bass aren't really in there that much. They might feed on like frogs and other things that get swept by the current. Most likely, though, they're just feeding on the bait fish like the bluegill and the perch and the shad. They're moving into the kind of the runoff areas to feed, and then the bass will feed on the bait fish. And so you can run to the back of a lot of these creeks that have very pronounced channels or creeks that feed them, and you can crush them sometimes the year by just taking advantage of that. And so a lot of times you might find that you need to not fish the lower end of the lake because there's not as many areas where that water runoff is prevalent. Maybe you want to focus on the midsection of the lake or the upper end of the lake because that's where mainly or the majority of the runoff areas are, and you want to take advantage of those current conditions. And so either taking advantage of the current from a dam or from that incoming water from rain is very important and can dictate which section of the lake to fish. Next, let's go to, and by the way, Justin, you say Wilson kicks your butt. Take, in the next month, for the next month and a half, take a Strike King caffeine shad on a spinning rod or a bait caster and skip it under boat docks. Every boat dock you can find from the Wilson Dam, basically all the way up the lake. I caught like 20 pounds of fish 3 days in a row on Lake Wilson, just fishing a fluke underneath boat docks. It's awesome. You can just crush them this time of year. From now through May, Senko or a fluke underneath boat docks or a chatterbait, you will catch a ton of fish. Just skip it there in the boat docks, you're good to go. That's just a little tip for Wilson. I fished a lot of lakes around the country, fortunately, so I kind of know some things. That's why if you want to book a one-on-one virtual fishing lesson with me, definitely something you can do over there on the far right section of the map or of the live stream over there. You can see that you can book a one-on-one virtual fishing lesson, and I can break down your lake, talk about all these factors, help you pick out which section of the lake, which area of the lake you need to be focused on. And also, Justin says, no Pickwick. We also have lake breakdowns on my website as well. I have a summer lake breakdown for Pickwick Lake. It'll give you areas on Pickwick. I actually did really well in the college national championship there at one point, fishing on Pickwick, offshore ledges. All the spots I caught them on are in that breakdown. Let's see here. So next up, let's go over to the PowerPoint back over here. So if we go to the next section, it's identifying active sections. So this is kind of the next phase of this presentation. So the first phase, we talked about why these sections are different. Water clarity, water temperature, available cover, available structure, size of bass, the current or water flow, and the species of bass. A lot of factors that differentiate these sections. And you're going to have to take all of these factors into account when making your decision. And this is something that is not easy for me to create like a guide in terms of when to choose a specific section based on all these factors. It's really going to depend week to week, based on what the water temperatures are doing, what stage the fish are in, the time of year, what type of lake you're fishing. There's so many factors that go into it. And it seems like you're only going to be able to understand which section of the lake to really fish after you've experienced all these different conditions and situations. And so I'm able to make these adjustments on the water and change because I've been doing this now for 15 years at a high level, like tournament level. And so I have always been having to make these decisions under pressure. And a lot of times I fail doing that, but a lot of times I succeed. And that's kind of what sharpens my skill. You know, we're basically throwing myself in the fire, and whatever comes out, comes out. And fortunately, I've come out on the other end of it at this point, and I'm able to identify which section based on these factors. But these are the things you need to be paying attention to when you go to the lake. And if you're not paying attention to these factors, definitely take note of them. And even if you're not successful, think about which of these factors maybe wasn't quite right and was causing you to be in the wrong section of the lake. And then when you do start catching fish, identify why you caught fish in that section of the lake and how these factors played into giving you success in that section. And as long as you take a little bit of time to diagnose what's happening after your day, regardless of whether you catch them or whether you don't, you're going to improve as an angler. This is kind of like what you do when you're playing football. You play football, you do your best when you're in the game, and then after the game, whether you suck or you win, you go back, you study game tape, you figure out what you're going to do, and you plan for your next opponent. And again, you might lose, you might be the Cleveland Browns, and you just keep losing over and over and over and over again. Or you might be, Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, and you guys are good, and you got the skills to be able to overcome maybe some challenges. And it takes just time and years of experience to build up so that even when you're having a tough day, you can overcome that. I don't want you guys to get on to me for my football references. I don't know if you guys are Cleveland fans or Kansas City fans, but you know what I mean. I don't know if you guys I'm sure most of you guys watch football, right? Anyways, I'm not super big into football. I follow football a little bit, but I'm not like super big. I'm big into bass fishing. That's pretty much it. I'm a Browns fan, easy. I won't go there. I did work in Cleveland for a little bit, so I went to one game in the stadium there, and actually got to see a Cavs game when they were playing the Raptors in the Eastern Conference Finals. A friend of a friend got me tickets, which was very cool. I got to see LeBron James play for like 30 minutes. No, for 15 minutes. It wasn't even 30. He played for 15 minutes, and then that was the year when they just destroyed the Raptors. I think it was 2016. They destroyed the Raptors. I'm just making everyone mad with all these sports things. I need to not be hitting all the hitting all the truths. I know you guys got Kawhi and won the championship, so that is good. Got some revenge. Anyway, so identify. I don't know why I'm talking so much about sports in this podcast or on this live stream. But anyways, identifying active sections. So what I mean by identifying active sections, the word active basically means sections where the bass are feeding and where you can actually start catching fish. And most of the time what I find is that when you're looking at a lake, certain sections of the lake are just going to be active. You're just going to have fish biting. It's going to be a perfect storm in that section where your water clarity, water temperature, everything is lining up and those fish are feeding. And you can obviously look at all the factors I talked about here to determine that, but another way is actually using these other ways to identify active sections. That was a big thunder. But one of those is looking for birds. I need to make a full video on just birds because I use birds to find fish more than my electronics, more than my past experience, more than anything. If you're good at watching birds, you will catch more bass. Most people do not pay attention to birds at all when they're on the water or very little. And I put a huge amount of weight into birds. I think a lot of people don't realize how much I do this, but literally, if I see birds running down the lake, I will stop the engine, pull up on the bank, and fish if I see certain birds in certain situations. And it may not fit my pattern at all. The bank might look terrible, whatever it is, but if there's a bird there that is one of these I'm about to talk about, I will pull up there and I will fish 100% of the time. And I find so many of my fish just following the birds. And the reason for that is because a lot of times these birds are feeding on bait fish. They're feeding on gizzard shad, perch, bluegill, things like that. And they will set up in the exact same positions the bass do. And crazy story, actually, let me pull up Google Earth here real quick. There was one tournament I fished on Lake Dardanelle, and it was a summer tournament. And what I found is that I was catching fish. I've never caught fish here again. But I was catching fish out here in the middle of the river. It was like way out here in the middle of the river. And there's this like pole. I don't even know if, yeah, there's a pole out here. And you guys can see this. It's literally this giant pole that's in the middle of the river. And right here is a really nice ledge with a shell bed. And it was hilarious because every single time I pull up this ledge and there was a blue heron sitting on that pole, I would catch 1 or 2 3 or 4 pounders. So I would catch a 3 or 4 pound bass every time I pulled up with that bird there. When that bird wasn't there, never caught a fish. And this was going on for like 3 weeks straight. And so I was fishing this pole. Every time a bird was there, I'd catch him. Every time a bird was not there, that heron was not there, I would not get a bite. And the reason was because the shad would pull up on top of the shell bed when the current started flowing. And so whenever the current was flowing, the blue heron knew that, pulled up to this spot, perched up, and would go and eat the gizzard shad, and the bass at the same time would come up on top of the shell bed and feed on the shad. So that bird was basically an indicator that the shad were there and the bass were there as well. And so it's super important to follow these birds. And some of my buddies think I'm crazy because I'm like talking about birds all the time, like literally all the time when I was tournament fishing, and they were like, dude, stop talking about the birds. I was like that crazy bird watching dude, but so true. And basically, it's there's these birds. These are the birds I pay attention to. There's other birds you can look at, but these are the 5 birds that I am big on. These are my hierarchy of birds. Top 5 birds in bass fishing. That's a great title for a video. Number 1 bird is heron. Blue heron. Number 1 bird. And the way I think about it is if there's a heron there, there's bait there. That's the rule. And on all these lakes in Arkansas and over in, I've seen it over in South Carolina, in Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, all these places around the country, when you see heron, the bait fish are going to be present. And for example, a couple weeks ago when I was fishing on, it was Beaver Lake, I think, I was running the bird pattern. All I would literally do is run down the lake and I would look for a wind-blown bank with a blue heron on it. I pull up and I catch a fish every single time. And I started running wind-blown banks without birds on them, never caught a fish, but every single bank I pulled up on with a blue heron on the bank with wind blowing on it, I was catching fish. And it didn't seem to matter if it was a channel swing bank, if it had a certain type of rock, it didn't matter. If there was a heron there, wind was blowing on it, I was catching them. And I wasn't using my electronics, I wasn't using anything fancy. Literally, you could have given me a boat from 1970, one of the old Bassmaster Classic boats. I could have run around the lake, no electronics, nothing, just look for birds and wind and caught them. And that's something that I do all the time, and a lot of my best fish catches have come just by looking at birds, not looking at my electronics, not looking at contour line maps, not paying attention to anything else but just the birds. And so heron equal bait, and blue heron are sometimes a little bit tricky to find, but what you'll be looking for is you'll be going down the bank and you'll be looking for these blue heron on these spots in trees, on the bank, and I'll just run real slow, 20 miles an hour down the lake, and just look for heron in trees and everything. And I'll sometimes go through certain pockets where I know, or certain sections of the lake where I know the fish are, and I'll just run back and forth, up and down the lake for like a 3-mile section. I'll run up 3 miles, down 3 miles, up 3 miles, down 3 miles, in circles till I see a bank with heron when it's a deal, and I will catch a ton of fish doing it. My fishing partner thought I was crazy when I did it, but we always caught him, and so it just happens. And then next type of bird are coots. Coots are an indicator of grass. They're the blackbirds with the white beaks. And if you see coots, that means there's usually some healthy green grass, because these birds will actually feed on grass. Hydrilla, milfoil, coontail grass especially. And on a lot of lakes where there's limited grass, for example, on like Lake Washita in central Arkansas, sometimes the grass isn't that thick. What I'll find is that the thickest patches of grass will have these coots around. And whenever I find coots running down the lake and I see like 20 black birds or 10 black birds grouped up in one area with those white beaks, I'm rolling over there with a chatterbait, little crankbait, and I am putting them in the boat. I'm crushing them. And these coots, I've caught so many fish just run the coot pattern in the springtime on Lake Washita and in the fall on Lake Washita. I literally just run through all the creeks, not doing anything, not looking at my electronics, well maybe to like steer so I don't hit something, but I just keep running. I see a bird, I run over there, I fish, I catch him. It happens all the time. I did it all the time when I was younger, and I was like big on birds. When I was like 16, I was like Birdman. That was me. Not, you guys know what I mean. Not the Birdman, but Birdman. Anyways, so another bird that a lot of people don't talk about, I've never heard anyone talk about this. My fishing partner on Lake Dardanelle still thinks I'm crazy, but I've used this so many times, and people think I'm crazy, but it's the crake birds, not crack birds, crakes. I don't even know how to pronounce their names, but the crakes. Basically, they are these birds that are blackbirds that sit up on top of lily pads. That's all they are. And they will, I don't know what they do on these lily pads. They're just blackbirds on lily pads. And it's crazy because I've gone on Lake Dardanelle. Let me switch over here really quick. And if we go through this area, what you'll find is that there's these lily pads all over Lake Dardanelle. So you got lily pad stretches like right here. The lily pads come out. There's not lily pads here anymore, but there's lily pads here. There's lily pads up. There used to be lily pads on the turn of the river here. They're kind of gone now. And then the lily pads were around in here. Let me find a better image. Just trying to show you some ideas of like where lily pads were on Dardanelle. I don't know why. There we go. Lily pads all through here. Lily pads through here. And there are certain years where I would run down the lake on Lake Dardanelle looking for blackbirds in these lily pads, and I would only pull up when I saw blackbirds in the lily pads, and I would catch a 4 or 5 pounder every single time. I'm telling you, blackbirds, the crakes, they are all about it. And the blackbirds are getting these lily pads, and I don't know why they're there. I don't know what they're eating, what they're doing. I don't know if they're feeding on the bait fish in the pads or whatever. Sometimes if you can find blue heron around pads, those are good as too, the blue herons. But, not blue herring, but blue herons. But those black birds, the crakes, those things are the deal with lily pads. If you find those blackbirds in the lily pads, you will find bass. I don't know if that's feed on them or what's going on, but those are the deal. Saw over here, Scrubbly says, Johnny, what about cormorants? That is a great segue. That is my honorable mention birds. So cormorants. That's an honorable mention. Cormorants are great birds. They feed on bait fish. Usually you'll find them on top of like offshore areas a lot of times and over standing timber and stuff, and they'll be diving into the water. And I find a lot of fish with cormorants. I've made videos about, or I've filmed videos where I've been following the cormorants, and that's how I find the bait. And a lot of times it just saves you time, so you don't have to graph for these areas. Just look for the birds, look for the cormorants, the heron, the coots, the crakes, gulls. You have the gulls that fly around, and you can find them schooling on bait, dive bombing bait. You guys have probably seen that or at least heard about that. That's also another honorable mention. These are really good when the fish are schooling. So you'll find schooling bass with the gulls. Cormorants, I find a lot of my offshore bait fish with cormorants. So the cormorants will be out in the middle of the lake in 20, 30 foot of water diving, and they can dive like 10, 15 feet down to get bait. So cormorants are my offshore birds. Heron are my shallow water birds. Coots are my grass birds. Crakes are my 5 pounder birds or lily pad birds, whatever you want to say. But crakes are lily pad birds. They also are good when they're around reeds, but crakes are just really good for everything. Gulls for schooling fish. That's kind of how it works. So recapping, heron bait, coots grass, crake lily pads, cormorants offshore bait, gulls schooling fish. And there you go. So anyways, that is the deal with bait or with the birds. So birds are super important. Now, sometimes the bird pattern doesn't work. You're not going to find the birds all the time. And so another way you can identify bait is with your fish finder. And so this is kind of the last thing I'm going to talk about is looking for bait fish. And usually if you can find bait fish in your Grafton area, it's a good indicator that the section of the lake you're fishing is going to be productive. So if you find a bunch of bait in the midsection of the lake, the lower end, the upper end, then there's a chance there's going to be bass in that area. And so usually what I'll do is I'll graph around with my down imaging and I'll be looking for bait fish. And so for example, in this image, there's no bait fish. I don't see any fish in this image either. I'm not fishing it. No bait, no fish, not happening. And there are exceptions to this. There are times when I will fish when there's no bait. And one of those exceptions is when I'm fishing in a lake that has really good crawfish population or that has a lot of rock. So for example, on Beaver Lake this last year, I was catching a lot of good fish on the upper end of Beaver Lake in the Clearwater section, and I was fishing rocky banks. And so there's a lot of rock that is up and down some of these banks. Let me just find an example. Where's that one bank I was fishing? Here we go. Like this bank right here. There's a lot of like rock that's down this bank. And what I find is that there was no bait fish around. I didn't find any bait fish on this bank. But there was rock there. There was a rock transition, and there were crawfish in those rocks. And so if I see no bait fish on my lake at all, I'm not seeing them around the graph or anything like that, my next step is to go to the rocks and start fishing a jig and a crankbait in the rocks, and those fish will be feeding on crawfish. So if you're in a section of the lake where you don't see any bait at all, that's actually not a bad thing. That actually just tells me go to the rocks, fish for crawfish feeding fish, and you're good to go. That's actually a really good way to identify a pattern on a section of a lake. If you spend 20, 30, 40 minutes graphing for bait and just don't find any, run to the rocks, fish for the crawfish. Fish. No fish for crawfish, but fish for the crawfish feeding fish. That's a lot of fish. Next is a situation where maybe you are seeing fish, but you might not have, or you're seeing bait, but you're seeing a lot of bait, and you're seeing too much bait fish. And what I mean by too much bait fish is like when half of your screen is bait fish, and you guys have all seen this before, where there's just bait everywhere. Huge balls of bait fish. In this situation, I don't like fishing these sections of the lake. I will leave when there's this much bait fish. And the reason for that is because basically these fish, when they want to feed, all they have to do is open their mouth, swim in any direction, and they're eating. And they don't need to do anything. They just swim in a straight line with their mouth open, and they will eat shad or bait. And so I don't like fishing when there's this much bait. It's hard for those fish to differentiate the bait fish from your fishing lure, and there's no reason for them to eat your fishing lure because there's just so much bait around that you basically just have to bump them in the face or reel it into their mouth as they're swimming around with their mouth open, and that's really hard to do. So if you start finding a section of the lake where there's a pile of bait like this, leave. Don't fish in sections of the lake where there's this much bait. I've tried it so many times before, it does not work. Just get out of there if you start seeing this much bait, a ton of bait, or it's taking up like half your screen. And the bait, for those who are unsure, is all these clouds of stuff here. That's your bait fish. And then finally you have kind of the good amount of bait fish. That's going to be where you have these balls of bait fish that are the size of a quarter to maybe the size of a silver dollar, and they're this big on the screen, and they're probably spaced out by, let's say, 5 to 6 inches on the screen, or maybe 10 to 12 seconds time-wise. So if you're seeing a ball of bait fish every 10 seconds on your graph, that's the size of a silver dollar or a quarter, that's a good amount of bait fish. You don't have too much bait where it's everywhere, but you have a good amount to hold some fish. And so when you start seeing bait fish balls like this, even if they're just these smaller little balls, they're the size of maybe like a nickel or a dime, not a big deal. Small little dime-sized balls of bait fish every 10 seconds, that's perfectly fine. Usually a little bit of bait fish is good, a ton of bait fish is bad, and no bait fish means go fish for crawfish feeding fish, or maybe go fish for bluegill feeders around brush piles and like shallow water areas in the summer around like bluegill beds, but don't worry about trying to fish for the shad fish. And so that's kind of another way to identify kind of the section of the lake I'm going to fish in, what I'm looking for. So that is kind of the idea here. See here, fish them. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of thunder outside. Ernest is asking, if you focus on crawfish, can you also focus on fishing boat ramps as a pattern? Yes, I'm actually gonna make a video about that. There's something that Matt Pangrak, who's on Bass Talk Live, I don't know, he didn't come up with it maybe, or maybe he did, but it's called BMR squared. So boats, riprap, boats, marinas, riprap, ramps. Boats, marinas, ripraps, and ramps. If you go to any lake in the country, you can fish boat docks, marinas, ripraps, and ramps, or bridges, marinas, riprap, and ramp. I'm gonna make a video about it. I'm butchering it now. I'm gonna call Matt and maybe see if he can help me go through the thing, because he knows about it more than I do. But we're gonna do a video on that, so I'll talk about that in another video. I am currently an hour and 10 minutes in. There are 330 people watching, and I am now hitting the wall of talking. So this is where I probably need a co-host to take off some of the burden of talking, and that's actually something I'm going to be doing hopefully next week, guys. I'm going to be bringing on Randy Blockett. Some of you guys know he's helping me with my map breakdowns on my website, and so that's something that we're going to be doing. And just so you guys know, as a reminder, I do have map breakdowns, new map breakdowns available on my website, fishthemoment.com, and this week we broke down 4 more lakes. We did Lake Cherokee in Tennessee, Old Hickory Lake in Tennessee, Lake Hartwell in South Carolina, and Lake Murray in South Carolina. And we have a lot more other breakdowns that Randy Blockett's been making for me. He's a tour pro, qualified for 18 or 17 Bassmaster Classics / Forestwood Cups, $1.9 million in career earnings. Awesome guy. really knowledgeable, does an awesome job with the maps. And if you do want me to break down a specific lake, you can always book a one-on-one virtual fishing lesson with me on my website, and I can break down your lake with you just like this, talking to you one-on-one. And my slots are filling up like crazy. Like, I only have 2 spots 3 weeks from now, or I guess 2 weeks from now at this point, and everything else is filling up already into May. And so if you want to get a one-on-one virtual fishing lesson with me to break down your lake, definitely book a lesson now because they are going fast. I expect all my May lessons to be booked up. I mean, I'm booked up all the way through May 15th, so the first half of May I'm already booked up. I expect to be fully booked up for all of May, probably by next week. So definitely book up a lesson right now if you really want one. We can talk about all these things. If you have questions about what I'm talking about or how it applies to your specific lake, we can go through navionics. We can break down exact areas, baits, techniques, everything like that. So just another plug for all my stuff. So now that we've kind of gone through all that, I'm pretty much done with my main content for how to identify the best section of a lake. I don't know if I wrapped all that up very well, but one more. See, I did have a wrap-up slide. I am smart. I'm an hour in and I forgot. So this is my last deal. So we've talked about from beginning, what is the different section of a lake, how I define section of a lake, what makes each section of the lake different, water clarity, water temperature, available cover, current flow, species of bass, all those factors. We've also talked about how to identify active sections of the lake by looking for birds and bait. And my last recommendation, if you're going to fish these, you're trying to find the active section, you're trying to find the right section of the lake to fish, my last recommendation is, when in doubt, fish fast. This is the number one thing I can recommend guys do if you want to become a more efficient and better fisherman and catch more fish. All the best anglers in the world that I know, and from past generation to now, best angler from generations ago was Rick Clunn, in my opinion. Amazing fisherman, really, really good. He fished fast. He tried to make as many casts a day as he possibly could. He would try to make 1,000 casts a day, and I've talked to Rick about this countless times over the phone and in person. And he basically said that he would just take a crankbait and he would run as much water as possible and try to make as many presentations as possible to the active bass. That's how he would do well. Next generation of best angler was Kevin Van Dam. He fished lightning fast as well, did the same thing. Make as many casts as you can in as many areas with a moving bait to catch those active bass. He loved catching fish on a crankbait. That's how he won a bunch of classics, a bunch of tournaments, is crankbait fishing. Now, the newer generation, we have Bryan Thrift and Jacob Wheeler. Both those guys fish super fast. Bryan Thrift will pull up on an area and he'll cover 30 spots in 2 hours. Same thing with Jacob. If you ever watched any of his videos, he fishes like 30, 40 spots a day. And really my rule of thumb when I'm trying to locate fish is I don't like to fish an area for more than 15 minutes if I don't get any bites. I spend 15 minutes maximum on an area. And basically what I used to do when I was trying to train myself in this, because I understood this whole concept when I was like 15. And what I did is I would actually set a timer on my phone. And after 15 minutes, my phone would ring. I would reel in my bait, put my rod down, strap him down, pick up the trolling motor, turn on the big engine, and run at least 100 yards to something different. And I did this every single time I went fishing for like a year. And I literally set a 15-minute timer on my phone and forced myself to just move and change areas. And I found that, I would experiment with doing this for 30 minutes. I would fish an area for 5 minutes and move on. I would try to do all these different combinations. And I found that 15-minute windows are the best for trying to find fish. If you're not getting bitten in an area in 15 minutes, leave. Jacob Wheeler's talked about this on his YouTube channel a lot. A lot of pros talk about this. This is the deal if you want to be efficient and catch a lot of fish. Next, try spots in all sections of a lake during a practice day. One big error that I see guys make, especially when they're tournament fishing, is they will try to fish on one section of the lake all day and just focus on that. And I actually made this exact mistake when I was fishing for my one tournament I fished this year on Beaver Lake before all the tournaments were canceled. And what I did is I focused on one section of the lake, this midsection here on Beaver Lake. And I fell into my own old dumb ways. I knew better, but I didn't follow it because I was like too stressed out about fishing the tournament again. Like my mind went crazy and I just like lost all my marbles. But what I always said in my practice days is don't focus on one section of a lake. If you look at Jacob Wheeler in his practice videos on his YouTube channel, he will burn 50 to 60 gallons of gas a day. Or maybe 50, I think he burn like 50 gallons of gas a day. He will run like 60 to 70 miles in a day. If he was fishing on Beaver Lake, every single day he'd be fishing from the dam down to the bridge down here. And now, obviously, not everyone's going to be able to afford to put that much gas in the boat and stuff like that, but that's what Jacob does to be one of the best anglers in the world. And what I recommend to guys is, if you're going to fish in a practice day, at least cover 2 sections of a lake. Don't just fish one section, because very rarely are you going to launch your boat in the correct section or the best section. You might launch your boat in a decent section, but not the best section. And so try spots in multiple sections of your lake throughout a practice day for a tournament, or just in a fishing day in general. Don't get stuck in one section of the lake and fish there all day just because you launch your boat here if you're not catching them. If you launch your boat here and you're only catching a fish every hour in this section of the lake, leave after 2-3 hours. Literally run to a new section of the lake. In my mind, you should be getting 2 to 3 bites an hour if you're on a really good section of a lake. If you're on a good section of a lake, 2 to 3 bites an hour at a minimum is what you should be getting. If you're on a decent section of a lake, you might get a bite an hour. If you're in a bad section of the lake, you might get bit once every 3 hours. Don't stick in one section of the lake and just fish there all day long. Move and change. And then finally, don't stop looking for the best section of the lake until you get 2+ bites in 3 areas. So not only are you getting bit 2 to 3 bites per hour, you want to make sure that you're getting 2+ bites in multiple areas. So you want to be running up the lake, for example, to the upper end here on Beaver, and you want to get 2 or 3 bites off this bank here, and then 2 or 3 bites on this bank over here, and 2 or 3 bites on this bank over here, and have 3+ areas where you're getting multiple bites. And that's what I found when I caught them really well on Beaver Lake, actually on the upper end of the lake a while back, is that I could pull up, I caught like a limit of fish off this point, I caught 3 or 4 off this point, 3 or 4 off this bank, 3 or 4 off this bank, and I was catching multiple fish off these areas when I got in the good section. And this was after my abysmal tournament day when I only caught 2 keepers, and I spent my entire practice and my whole tournament day in this one section of the lake, and I was getting a bite like every 2 hours, and I was just dumb. I was just trying to force this area of the lake to work for some reason. But then I went back like 3 days later, ran to this section of the lake, and I was just ripping them. And so it wasn't that I was doing the wrong thing. I was throwing the same bait in the same type of water with the same approach as I was in the midsection of the lake. But here I was getting a bite every 2 hours. Here I was getting 3 or 4 bites every single hour. And I caught enough weight where I'm in the top 10 in that tournament. And it was just dumb of me to not go check this section of the lake on tournament day. So anyways, that is kind of the end of the main content here, and I'm just going to answer a few questions here, guys. I'm just going to spend about 12 minutes answering some questions for the live Q&A, and then after that, I'm going to end the stream after an hour and a half. And so let's get over here to the questions and see what people had to say. Look like there's some football related stuff. I'm just going to pretend that I didn't see that because I don't want to know if people are angry at me. Let's see here. Wow, lots of people talking in the comments. Good to see everyone on the stream. So many people are on. 348 people. That is awesome. So let me see what everyone is saying, though. We got Gary's asking, summertime smallmouth, big water lake, Ontario. If you get big wind and the clarity changes, do you leave? I am not an expert on those type of fisheries, the Ontario, Lake Erie, like big Great Lake type fishing. So I'm probably not qualified to talk about that, unfortunately. I have a lot more experience south, mid-south, basically everything from like everything south like of, I don't know, I say that. I grew up in Wisconsin, so I'm pretty good on grass lakes. That's where a lot of lakes were, and I have fished a lot of smallmouth lakes, but I did not spend a lot of time on Lake Michigan, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, things like that. So I would say I'm pretty confident on pretty much all lakes up north except for those giant, big fisheries. Just don't have very much experience doing that, so don't want to give you any bad advice there. Let's see here. Keeping it go. Thanks, David, for vouching for the map breakdowns. Said I bought a Lake Lanier breakdown. Excellent value. Highly recommend these lake breakdowns. Appreciate that, David. We put a lot of work into them, so I'm glad you guys enjoy. Let's see here. Dan says, are larger bass in deeper water due to more oxygen, deeper options for fish? I wouldn't say that the larger fish are living deeper on these lakes. So, for example, kind of the idea was when I was on Conroe that the bigger fish live on the lower end of the lake. Let me go back over to Conroe. I don't know if it's actually depth of water oxygen thing. I think that it's mainly just because there's probably more forage available, and it's easier for these fish to escape and feed in that cleaner water. And so they might be feeding up in 2, 3, 4 foot of water, but it's easy for them to escape out into that deeper water and feed more offshore. And so they're less susceptible to fishing pressure. And I think that those fish just can grow bigger because there's more available forage in this zone. I'm not 100% sure on the biological reasons why. I don't think that these bass are feeding, just because they feed deeper isn't the reason why they grow bigger. But there may be something to that, but I'm not 100% on that. Let's see here. Another question from Dan. Rated on the birds. I've seen them nearby on many of my best fishing moments. That is good. Yeah. And then Bassman79 says blue herons are always good luck. Yes, that is true. Justin is asking on Google Earth, how do you get it to go back in years? I don't see the option when I pull up on the computer. You need to be using Google Earth Pro. I've made a video about this on my channel. Just go to Fish the Moment, Google Earth, and watch that video explain how all this works, how to go back in time, how to drop pins, save waypoints, transfer them to your fish finder, all kinds of stuff. Let's see here. Ernest asks, let's see here. Oh, already answered that question. And one more question, or a couple more questions. Scrubbly says, when do you start moving offshore after the spawn? I've made a video about this as well. Just look up Fish the Moment, when to fish offshore. I've made a complete video about when to start fishing offshore after the spawn. It's on my channel. I posted it last June. So if you go back on my video page, go back to last June, I've made a video about that. It'll be when to start fishing offshore. Dan says, thanks for the deep answer. Yeah, I just meant deeper end of the lake. Awesome. Or thanks for the answer, not the deep answer, but thanks for the answer. Let's see here. Ron says, where do you start your pattern if it's calm and sunny, but the water is 0 to 1 foot of visibility? Kind of depends if there's a lot of vegetation and grass. I like to get basically around the shade of like grass, the shade of wood. If it's sunny and calm and 0 to 1 foot of visibility, just find shade, the thickest shade you can find, and go fish a bait up shallow. Shallow water, fish in a foot of water, to 5 foot of water maximum, and just find those deepest, shadiest areas and flip, throw a spinnerbait, a frog, stuff like that. Let's see here. What's the best bait to use, and what's the best bait to use, and what bait did you use? Do not know what that's in relation to, Jonathan. Bait is. I'm thinking I'm taking that out of context, so I will not answer that one. I need more context for that one. Rocky says, shallow, dirty impoundments like Ross Barnett. Will the bass stay shallow all summer? For sure. They will stay shallow in Ross Barnett year-round. There are fish that move offshore, but there's also fish that just live shallow. So, for example, on Lake Dardanelle, one of my favorite fisheries, it's a shallow, muddy water fishery. I can catch fish in a foot of water to 2 foot of water literally year-round. It doesn't matter. I can catch them in less than 5 feet all year round. If your water visibility is less than a foot visibility, or like if you have a foot of visibility on your lake somewhere, even if it's way up the lake, those fish will live, or they'll feed in 5 foot of water or less year round. And there are potential options to catch them offshore. Like on Dardanelle, there are ways you can catch them offshore on this lake in deeper water out to like 8 to 10 feet. But most of the time, if I'm catching them on Dardanelle, it's less than 5 foot of water up shallow. See here. Will a musky dominant lake affect the way the bass act? Yes and no. Kind of depends. Really, a lot of times those lakes have grass. Those musky dominant lakes will have grass. And those bass like to get in the grass anyways, and they're feeding on the bluegills, so it doesn't affect them as much as you would think. If there's no grass, then it will. It'll make those fish a little more nomadic and move more. But a lot of times then those are smallmouth lakes and the bass are already nomadic. So I find that it's not as big of a deal, those musky in the lake, as you would think. That's all. Most of my lakes I grew up on fishing up north they had pike and musky, all of them. And best bait for post-spawn spotted bass. 2 for you. Number 1 would be let's see here. Let me pull up this. This is going to be the last question of the night, guys, because I need to get a little bit of a break. I've been going all day long, so I think I'm going to end it after this question. But Two baits. One is going to be some sort of top water is always going to be good for post-spawn spotted bass. So let's say like a Lucky Craft Sammy. Doesn't really need to be a Sammy, but any sort of top water walking bait is going to be really, really good for those spotted bass. Throwing it over the top of points and shallow water. You can throw it up shallow, you can throw it offshore, but a little kind of 3 or 4 inch walking top water bait is going to be awesome. Another bait's going to be that Megabass Spark Shad. Just fire that thing around offshore, again up shallow. Really good bait. So spotted bass tends to spend a little bit more once they get offshore in the summertime, and so a little swim bait and a top water bait are hard to beat for those post spawn spotted bass. So that's it. That is the last question. Actually, one more question because Bradley asked a good one here. It says, do you use a bait or rod to measure water visibility? Usually what I'll do is just take a bright white or bright chartreuse bait, put it on the tip of my rod, stick it down in the water, and then I'll see how far down I can see the bait. Once I can't see anymore, I grab the tip of my rod, lift it up, and I say, okay, that's about 3 foot, that's about a foot. Just kind of the eye test. Nothing fancy, not like I have gauges or anything on my boat for water clarity. So that's going to be it, guys, for the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed and found this useful. The topic I feel like was a really good one, identifying the best section of the lake to fish. And I really appreciate everyone's support on Patreon and all the guys who voted on my poll for this week's video topic. And so I'll be making another poll on my Patreon page for all my Patreon members to vote on the upcoming topic for the stream. This next stream, I'm going to be doing with Randy Blockett, and so I'm going to put up 3 or 4 video ideas or live stream topics that I can cover with Randy Blockett, and we have some really good ideas in terms of talking about like old school versus new school fishing, the importance of electronics, and coming from a guy who maybe grew up without electronics and then me with electronics, what things are necessary in terms of like what you need to spend money on for electronics, things like that. We've got a lot of great topics we can discuss, and all those topics will be voted on my Patreon page. So if you do enjoy the content and want to support me and also have a say in what type of content I make on Fish the Moment, join my Patreon page. It's on my website, fishthemoment.com. Go to the Support Me tab on my website, and you can find my Patreon page there, or just look me up, Fish the Moment, on Patreon, and you can support me that way. Also, again, go to the website, check out my new map breakdowns, check out my one-on-one virtual fishing lessons, and all my fishing playbooks. It's a great way to support me if you enjoyed the stream. And for everyone who's watching or listening to this stream on the podcast apps, whether that's Spotify or on Apple iTunes, definitely leave a review for the podcast. Even if you're just listening here, if there's 316 of you guys on right now, if you really enjoyed this live stream and you're here still watching, go onto the Apple Podcast app. It's on your phone. Just go onto your phone, look up Apple Podcast app, type in Fish the Moment. That's all you got to do. And you'll pull up the podcast, leave a review. If you leave me a 5-star review, that'd be awesome. Right now, the most reviewed podcast on the Apple Podcast app is Bass Talk Live. And it'd be awesome if we could become the #1 reviewed podcast on the iTunes app. All we need is 1,000 reviews, 1,200 reviews. We already have like 100 on there. It'd be awesome to be able to overtake Bass Talk Live for the most reviewed podcast, and that way I can maybe get some more sponsorship, bring on more guests. I've talked about this before. If I get a lot of reviews on the podcast app, then I can try to bring on pros like Jacob Wheeler. We can get Rick Clunn in here. I can try to get Bryan Thrift, a bunch of guys to get on the podcast and talk fishing with me. We can kind of go back and forth. I think that'd be awesome content for you guys. The only way I can do that, though, is if the podcast is popular enough. So definitely check out the podcast apps. Leave a review for Fish the Moment Podcast. And if you guys do enjoy the stream, leave a comment down below as well, letting me know what you think once this video is uploaded to YouTube. So anyways, thanks you guys for checking out the stream. Really appreciate all the support as always. And I see y'all next week, same time, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. See y'all next week.